Hey everyone, my name's Andy. I'm from Finding Value Finance. Today we've got Francis Hunt with us. Thanks for showing up, Francis. Really appreciate it. He's
Pleasure.
from themarketsniper.com. If you guys enjoy this clip, check out his website. So thank you, Francis, for coming on. Really appreciate it. How are things going today?
Yeah, great. Very good. We're most known probably for our YouTube channel where we pursue through the Market Sniper, we pursue macro technical charts. And much like your audience and yourself, we have a very big interest in the pending commodity cycle, precious metals, of course, and a number of other things. What I'm interesting, just as maybe an opening statement of some interest for your community, is something that's really fascinating for us is we're seeing the great unraveling of the financialization of everything. The end of that trend. So we were known for calling in 2020 the end of the debt markets. We said, that's it, your 40 bull is over. In August, after the events of March 2020, we said, that's it, you're done. It never gets that good again for debt. And you're going to have a sustained period of higher highs and higher lows in a trend of interest rates, which is going to have the corollary effect of debt deflation. So we've been net short TLT, for example, which is a 20 to 30 year plus debt instrument. So that's part of the one half of the trend, the unraveling of the financialization of everything, which also has other interesting side plays. So we've been short the yen against most currencies, of which the USD JPY is one of them. And other currencies have also played in that when we've had periods where the dollar's been soft. So there's currency things you can do on that side. That's the death of the hyper financialization of everything. The other positive side of that, which is less about shorting things that are going to fail. Many people battle with that. Without method, it's really hard to short. We do that and we have a method, but the long side is very much the commodity and the back to assets, things, and physical elements, which have almost been suppressed by the hyper financialization of everything. So naturally, resources go where they're getting their most reward. And when you hyper overextend on one particular theme, that means somewhere else is not getting feed, is not getting the water, is not getting the sustenance. So you, by hyper overextending on the financialization of everything, it's all been about debt and credit card companies and borrowing for housing and all of that. Housing is actually, although it's a physical thing, it's actually just been an instrument for financial leverage in the end. So the big note, and if you understand that, the warning that comes to everybody in that is you certainly need to be aware that the risks of an interest rate spike, even beyond the levels we're at, are far higher, in my view, than ever getting back to the levels of March 2020. So that could be a very effective tool for destroying your middle classes. So I want to put people on notice for that. If you've got a lot of leverage, it's a great way for BlackRock to end up buying your own home when you're distressed and finding yourself a tenant in your own home with a corporate lease owned by Vanguard or one of these crowds. The other thing that's more macro and is systemic that might be interesting also for your audience is when they essentially want to bring in my opinion, an overarching ruling class and a Bolshevik communism type model. So there'll be exceedingly wealthy people, which they've done very, very well with hollowing out the Gini curve, that will be part of this ruling corporate fascism, and then serfdom. So the middle is under attack. And one of the best ways you bring in an extreme communism with a technological surveillance overture on it is you first hyperextend capitalism. So if you think of Conor McGregor with his fights, you'll have a lot of male audience, maybe they'll enjoy it. UFC, one of the best ways of knockout punching somebody is drawing them in where they overcommit and stretch for a strike coming in, and you're just bleeding back, and then you're rocking back, and as they're overextending, trying to cross and reach, you catch them with it's the short punch they never see that knocks them out. And that might have been, one of Conor's favorite knockouts, which he did in a minute. Now, I'm not saying he's a great fighter and all he's done since, but it's a figurative example of what actually happens. So we've hyperextended capitalism, but all the adverse effects to also create a knee-jerk resentment for capitalism. So there's college kids coming out here that think that Banks getting bailed out is capitalism. That taking 9 years to pay off a car and buying 50% of it is capitalism. That making poor Indian, Chinese work in kid factories so that Nike and various other produce and apparel makers can churn out low-cost footballs and sneakers is capitalism. And in actual fact, it's hyper overextended capitalism, which has a greed manifest of a corporate malfeasance behind it. And when you hyper overextend capitalism, it's the perfect setup for what they truly want to bring in. So the whiplash to that is they create the ultimate resentment. They highlight the damage to the planet caused by capitalism because you want to buy, a new pair of sneakers every year, and you're putting the kid in the terrible sweatshop, and you're putting, your Tesla's putting the children of Africa in the cobalt mine working 14 hours a day. All of these things. So these are two macro trends that I kind of follow and watch, and people can trade and invest these to help build wealth and protect yourself from the overarching agendas that I see that are being pursued. And the good story is there should be a good story coming for commodities out of that. Anyway, that's quite a lot for you to unpack. So let me leave you to it.
Yeah. So I've heard you. I watched your channel. You talk about hyper stagflation. What is hyper stagflation, and what's your macro view on this hyper stagflation that you talk about a lot in your videos?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And the problem I have with thinking is that people look to the past and they need to hold on to something known. It's almost like we're all in a river and we're looking for a log to hold on to, or a rock. We're getting washed away in flood waters. So there's a tendency to do associative thinking. That means we need to connect onto something known. We can't exist in an abyss where there actually has been no previous precedent for what we're in. So a lot of people say, well, it's like the 70s. And I'm here to say there are features of it and elements that have certain aspects of the 70s, but you have never seen anything like this before. This is an extremist version of some of the aspects of the 70s, plus other things have been magnificently overextended that were never even in the reckoning in the 70s that now exist today. And technology, surveillance finance, which is a very dangerous trend, the central bank digital token, all of these things. So you've got to remember, even you standing in the same river 10 years later are not the same man, not the same cells, and it's not the same H2O particles swirling around your ankles. You're older, you might be more toxic, you might be diseased, hopefully not, hopefully you're healthy, but I mean, the water might be contaminated, it might have more production up, so everything has changed. So there's a tendency, even when you reproduce exactly the same thing, not to realize that actually it's still not the same. So when we are talking about the current financial system, I mentioned hyper stagflation to diminish the association with the stagflation that many people remember of the 70s that were economically inclined in the 70s. Yes, there are certain attributes. And what's the common denominator? Well, it's economic malaise. So a real problem that there's not growth and people are being squeezed and the living costs are hard, and stubbornly high inflation. So, and a lot of that in the 70s came around the Vietnam War and the original gold fix to the dollar that the French then called on, sent their own ship and refused the New York Fed holding their metal that was offered to them when they said, you know what, we think you printed more dollars than there is metal. We'll rather take the metal, please, because it was declared as a gold-backed. And you could claim it, but obviously for convenience, people didn't claim it if they felt it was in a safe place. And then they got called on their bluff, the Nixon government, and that's the 1971. And of course, too much blanket bombing of Vietnam in the name of fighting communism and the warmongery, and a lot of people getting very rich, but a certain cartel getting rich whilst toxifying the stability of the general financial system for everybody else. So you don't raise one small elite group up that are connected without passing on that malfeasance, you don't have the day without the night, and the cost was all socialized onto us. And what that was a weakened dollar, and then it led from 71 into the 80s gold run that many people will probably be familiar with once we went to a floating system and Nixon temporarily removed the conversion. So that was the 70s. It's a totally different set of conditions here, because what's actually happened is the entire globe has become a leper colony, a synchronized leper colony of indebtedness. So this is, it's a bit like comparing the depression of the 1930s, where large parts of China who had completely disassociated with the Western economic system, and they wouldn't have even necessarily have known. Now we have a global synchronized state of disease where everybody's had to kiss the leper to join the leper colony. In other words, they pursued similar things of financialization of everything. You've had Australia's property boom, you've got the UK's property boom, you've got corporate expenditure that has gone too high, borrowing, derivatives, all the same tools that are utilized to entrap and undermine the social structure of a society, utilizing the financialization of everything concept. And it's conspicuous consumption. It's driving alcohol, porn, pop music, all the same contaminants, and we've all been toxified. So the scale. So that's where the hyper comes from. There is nowhere to go or run. Many of us will go, well, I'll arbitrage this. I'll go somewhere else where these conditions don't exist. Well, it's cold in the Antarctic, and you're only going to have a penguin to talk to. That's if they'll let you go there. So principally, it's a pretty difficult game for freedom seekers to gamify this. And you actually have to look to nations that you used to look down on, not that we ever should look down on, but that certainly economically you might have considered are less stable nation states. You'll find that the Eastern Europe are far more worldly wise in terms of, the communistic tendencies. They're not being fooled. You speak to a Croat, a Serb, or anyone from the ex-Yugoslav states, they're not falling for media in quite the same way as true Western nations. Maybe the average American in the mid-states might, or even New York, California, for all that matter. So you have to start thinking, where do you even see this thing out? This is a much bigger game, this reset gamification that they're bringing on us. You're living the Chinese curse of being born in very interesting times. And you're going to see the death of a system and the likely introduction of a very, very draconian, and in my opinion, slightly dystopian system. So many people go, well, that's a nihilistic comment because it's very black-pilled. And I'm like, if you were born in these times because you can handle it. Only certain people get picked to run the hardest obstacle course, and you've got to be bold, brave, but you don't survive it by not acknowledging the fullness of this challenge. And it is one of the most fullest challenge. So I use hyper for that word. I need your attention. I need you to understand the scale. And I need you to really get that there's not so many places that you can hide, but there will be some places better than other. And that the degree of stagflation and the compression on the working and middle classes are going to get absolutely chronic. And if you are exposed to debt, it is for almost certainly, and my suspicion is there will be an interest spike involved in this, which could even see, ironically, the dollar spiking, not forever, but temporarily, on a sort of dollar milkshake type concept in an environment where they are resisting the BRICS, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot, again, to understand in that, but we've specialized in this. I mean, 15 years ago, I reserved the URL, global stagflation. That's how confident I was that was going to be. In the end, I've gone, with different branding, and we chose the reset sniper only to have the market sniper and the crypto snipers are three-pronged approach to branding, and only to have the World Economic Forum park its tanks on our garden and start using the word reset in the last 5 years. So they've come to us in terms of naming and branding, and we've had a long-term vision of this is how it ends. And there's a beautiful symmetry to the world, Andy. When you get, for example, the Goldilocks economy that supposedly Greenspan, the greatest economic criminal, in my opinion, that should be tried for economic crimes against the global society, bequested you the Goldilocks economy, which was the globalization era where everything got pushed to the lowest cost denominator globally, and we used poorer nations to be workshop for everything, and we pushed hyper consumption and financial engineering because the costs were going lower. You didn't have much inflation, so you could actually be lax with interest rates so that you could further stimulate the hyper overextension of capitalism that we got under Greenspan, that then bequested these bailouts and these toxic banking system that we seem to all be responsible for. When you have this extended 6 months of summer and never having a night, the warning is you're about to get 6 months of winter. You've changed location. You've gone to the Antarctic, as I was saying earlier. Yeah, you got your 6 months of light. Good luck, because now you've got six months of depression, lack of vitamin D, and you better have lots of fatty fish and a real warm place to hunker down. And unfortunately, again, people don't see, and it's very, as a macro technician, as far as you blow off to the upside, so you have the greater collapse to the downside. And it works the other way in a more positive way. When you get a capitulation, and we called that oil was going to have a chronic collapse that would probably see a trade single digits. We did that in the mid 60s. And we stood on stages and did it. So it's not an after timing statement. We called that, and you got that super collapse. And that actually was the prediction of the March 2020 events. And what you subsequently get now is where you're sitting back up at $96. But in actual fact, the globe is in a global recession, rolling into, because we don't do normal recessions, quite likely a continued increasing rates environment, which is typical of the Fed being late and tying increasing rates in an already pained retail market. And you're going to roll into a full-blown depression that they're essentially going to cause another collapse. So the central banking cartel are the purveyors and the creators of the extreme volatility. And that's something someone else needs to, and everybody else needs to understand in truth. They are not helping you. They're ensuring the eventual collapse of the system.
Yeah. So when you say hyper stagflation, and maybe I can understand this by, 1 second, reading room lock meeting. So when we look at the hyper stagflation, if I were to kind of say it back, it's a collapsing GDP that is inflationary from the debt. Is that the best way to say it?
Well, GDP is a very flawed measure, I must highlight. Essentially, we've been sold this narrative of perpetual growth. The only thing you should seek is growth. That means ever greater consumption, because we actually measure gross domestic product is actually a basic of consumption. It equals gross domestic consumption, so you have to consume more, and that's deemed a healthy economy. And if you haven't consumed more than last year, you're not growing. I mean, imagine that's your diet, Andy. Each year I insist that you eat more than you did last year. We used to have a society where you'd have a great pair of boots that you wore in over many years and you would keep for an extended period. Now we have 1 year sneakers. You have basketball players that wear a pair of sneakers for 1 day. And the whole concept of this is wastage. So if you keep upping wastage, Heinz of tomato increased the wastage to increase sales. This isn't morality. This isn't capitalism. This is greed in manifestation without moral principle. And there's a complete void in what goes on. So if you increase the wastage immensely, you will have to consume more things. You will have to go to other nations to get additional resources to keep replacing that which you continue to consume that could have lasted for longer. If we just resorted to 1 or 2 variances of very high quality items, and we looked after them and cared for them, and we didn't have that. So this notion of growth is ever expanding, and the GDP is a bit of a failed construct. We would have a far more stable society if everybody had a combination of savings and investments, bought 1 or 2 quality items and looked after them. And if they were unfortunate, they were completely destroyed, we'd get rid of them. So that's the growth and the GDP part. So I wouldn't utilize that in the explanation. What you're actually going to have is 2 painful events. In the same way, in the Goldilocks economy, there was no inflation and borrowing was cheap, and you could continue to expand, and your stock market portfolio ran up. So you got asset price mega appreciation in an environment that you had very stable, low costs in spite of stimulatory lending. What you actually get is, it's simpler to think of the exact opposite corollary. You're going to have stagnation of asset prices. Many of them are based on a consumer who's going to be squeezed. His nuts are going to be so squeezed, he's going to be bleeding out of his eyeballs in terms of where he stands. So the inflationary element is pushing the costs. The wages are lagging. They've already got all the people working in the family, unless we're going to take the 5-year-old kid and put him in a sweatshop in India too. So we've gone from single, working families. We've expanded. All the fat and all the additional space on the runway has been absorbed. Now the plane crashes into the trees at the end of the runway, and we've really taken all the space and room for maneuver out of this, and we've hyperextended with many crookery and chicanery and elements of fraud, etc., etc. I mean, there's talk of Nvidia being the next Enron, all sorts of, book us some revenue this time, we'll work it off and give you back, undercharge us on costs this quarter, and we'll you've got a CEO of a company that's currently holding up the tech boom, pulling tricks like that, who got fined 600 grand. That's barely a swat on a wrist when your options are making you hundreds of millions at a time. So, I mean, there's absolute corporate malfeasance as well. There's something known as the control fraud, where the executive management class actually does things for a corporation that boosts their own personal options and wealth building at the expense of the long-term sustainability of the business. And, car dealers, if you're Ford, for example, they did it, borrow and leverage the place up to the hilt, use all that money to buy back stock so that you push things up. Whilst there's a low interest rate environment. Basically, you've got the management of Ford now becoming technical traders on debt instruments. I mean, as if they qualified for that. They're not even qualified to be decent car leaders. They've got low morality, and now essentially they're leveraging the company to pull tricks like that. Then you channel stuff, your dealers, so that it makes your numbers look better. And then a year from now, after you set the super high reward, make me a billionaire, but I have to do this real stretch target, on my options. And then you pull every financial chicanery in the book, and you actually make out like a bandit in 3 years, if that's the duration, and you get so many options and so much money rain on your head. You've never been wealthier. You buy your stock price up, and then all your dealers are ruined. They sat discounting your brand, with absolute throwaway deals and shotgun finances and all sorts of things. That's not long-term custodianship of a system. And that small little example I gave you of what's known as a control fraud done by professional management on a long-standing branded institution that could be better managed for the long term is the lack of principle. What we actually have is a system that lost principle and is purely there for who can rape it for the harshest, hardest way in the current term for their own personal gain at the long-term deficit to whatever it is they're custodian of, the corporation, the economy, the culture, and the society. And you have this insider class where it's become the new de facto standard that everybody is a serial rapist, a financial serial rapist. And we are the people that are standing back and are getting the toxicity that they defecate over us while they suck the honey out of all future sales by bringing sales forward under ridiculous schemes. And when you understand that, and then we revert that back to hyper stagflation, you have the malfeasance of decades of fraudulent conduct that has gone unchecked by the SEC. You've got the Fed members themselves that are implicit in all sorts of various things of self-enrichment in the central banking cartel. And what you actually see is your ruling class of communism have already been stocking their larder at your expense. All you're waiting for is for the special rules for you and the special rules for them to be determined. And then you're going to be finding out how little true freedom you have. So when we understand all that, you've got to defund the criminals. You've got to pay as little tax. You've got to get out of countries that are going to have a harsher downswing. And if you look at the average wealth over the Western area versus the average wealth in other nations, there's going to be a mass leveling So that's another macro trend we call a mass leveling of relative perceived wealth on Americans in America versus that in other nations. And Europeans too, by the way, they're not getting away with this. And the Commonwealth, so Australia, New Zealand, Canada. So all of these English-speaking nations are going to have a real harsh, bumpy ride. So there's going to be a loss of mood, a loss of entrepreneurial spirit, an intense socialization of everything. Welfare is going to come on just at the same time as you've got a demographic that is peak retirement in the States and is actually going to become the biggest takers from the system and is ceasing to contribute to the system. So, I mean, this is the music to slit your wrists to. My whole point is not to make people miserable. You have to fully understand the weight of all the trends that are now against you. You had the mega boom. You had the preeminence of the American century. What you need to understand is there may be better places for you. And we talk about it. You should have foundations. You should have multiple homes outside of America. You should certainly have precious metals. You should have them in many different jurisdictions that are not all of Western nature, because there will be some arbitrage in how people are behaved. And I actually see Eastern Europe and the Middle East actually being better treated in terms of the shakeout on the downdraft than what you'll see in America. And we're already getting this hyper perversion of outcomes in the likes of California, Portland, New York, et cetera, and they're getting in some pretty funky laws in there that really want people to take notice, and they're not being rolled back. So that's where we're at, and that's why the hyper stagflation has a totally different sociality. The community contract between individuals of self-respect is being undermined. The divisiveness, the duality, the rage, the anger, and the introduction. They're going to say, well, we can't leave you guys to look after yourself. Look how angry and you fight. You've got the Trumps and the Obamas, the Hillarys and the Bidens and all of this. So these are all designed to create all these stark polarities that mean, you guys can't get on with each other. We need to have a firm hand ruler, which is a great setup for a corporate fascist Bolshevik communistic dictatorship, and they will throw down rules and they'll do enforcement, and that worries me for Americans. And they're great people. I've got nothing against America, the country. What's happened there is so bad that people need to really take a deep look and get organized.
So when someone looks at this hyperstagflation, how can one follow it? What are some indicators that they can watch to say, and watch the progression of this occurring? Do we watch the value of the dollar? Is it inflation? Are we looking at, what metrics are you looking at, or what indicators are you looking at that someone could follow along and say, man, Francis is nailing this, and you can just see this deterioration in America?
So when I talk about currencies, if you're talking about dollar, you have to talk about currencies, because the dollar is generally measured against other currencies that all suffering from the same disease. So it's a bit like going to a beauty contest with all the lepers. It becomes a very much relative concept. In actual fact, the biggest Ponzi that has the strongest defense actually won't be the first to go. It will more likely be the last to go, which is why I actually say something that sounds to many a little perverse, that the dollar could actually spike because it's being relatively measured to other currencies that will fall further. They're smaller, less tightly strung, bound frauds, and as a result, and they don't have a big defense mechanism to protect themselves, and they certainly don't have the same scale of reserves or force. So if we're talking currencies relative to other currencies, the one that we've identified that there's going to be essentially there's a firing order. It's a bit like you open up, I was fortunate to own a Bentley GT, and you lift up the bonnet, it actually gives you the firing order of all the cylinders on the hit. And all are going to get fired when you're driving that vehicle. There's not one that gets skipped. However, there is an order and a sequence in terms of things. So all these fiats are essentially going to collapse, but that's a bit like saying all my cylinders will run when I start the car and start driving it. It's hardly genius. The key thing is, if you're a trader stroke investor, which we are macro investors, we're not day traders. We are, you could do 3 or 4 trades in a year and you leave them on. This is not screen watching. We love freedom. not roasting our eye sockets on 9 screens. But nonetheless, there are trades that could be taken that can be opened in a year and closed in the same year that can be extremely profitable. So it's our express opinion that the charts show you the firing order. You've got to understand the fundamentals to know it's going to happen, but in what order does it happen? How do you trade? How do you position? It's almost playing one of those games where there's stepping stones, but once you land on them, you've got 3 seconds before they get sucked into the marsh as well, and you've got to jump for the next one. So it's you know, sure, you need to get to the other side, but how and what stones do you jump on and where do you jump next? So we look at the charts for that, and that's the macro technical. And it's quite clear to us that the yen technically is showing that it's going to be one of the first of the majors to go. The majors. Don't forget there's emerging currencies. We've already been playing the Turkish lira for the last 10, 13 years. You know, the Turkish lira was at 3.1. It's actually it was 1.3 the first time I traded it. They'd already had brought it down. It was 1.3. We traded to 3s, 5s, right the way through 20s and 25s, you know, and they've given us 6 setups over the space of the last 13 years, and we've been in every one. Now the borrowing cost is almost too high because they've raised interest rates that you have to be sure you catch it at a major period of further capitulation. So everybody can be reasonably accurate on emerging market economies. Can you trade 2 majors and actually have a positive carry? You've got to remember that interest rates on the yen are lower. So essentially, if you short the yen, you are borrowing yen, paying a lower interest rate on $1 million of borrowed yen, and you're putting it in essentially a US bank and getting a higher deposit rate on the yen. So you're getting an income or a positive carry trade. And at the same time, you're playing it for appreciation on the dollar getting stronger than the yen. So what actually happens is it's a trade you can have open-ended for quite an extended period, and you almost get paid for it. Instead of it costing you, there being an opportunity cost. So if you just look at, and then you say, well, why would that be? Well, I can tell you reasons why I think it will be, but I'm seeing it in the chart, so I don't tend to question. They're about 15 years, between 11 and 15 years democratically older than America. They give birth for every couple to 0.91 new future taxpayer after it gets through university. So that means they don't even replace one single parent for a pair of parents that die. So the demographics is absolutely wrecked. Then you look at the debt environment, they're probably not as bad as America, but officially they're worse. So they're going from 250 to 300% GDP debt. Now, America's declared number is quite a lot less. Of course, there's a whole bunch of off-sheet balance sheet items that are not included in that number that actually means that America is quite a lot worse. But they can run with that fraud and lie for a lot longer than Japan can, because Japan is not the world global currency, albeit that threatened. So Japan essentially has a ridiculous debt and was until recently doing yield curve control. In other words, by holding the interest rate down, you are hyper extending the value of the debt because there's an inverse relationship to it. You're saying, no, it's still worth this. It's still worth this. It doesn't need to pay you more than that. It's a very worthwhile asset. At the same time, you're creating more and more and more of it, like sand on the beach. Now, anything that's globally proliferated at such a rapid rate is never valuable. Scarcity is one of the core things of value. You know, you've got 2 Olympic pools of gold that you've got to spread between, I don't know how many billion people. So just by having a couple of ounces, you're already, you know, multiples above a number of people. And if you talk about platinum, you're not even getting, you know, you're barely filling a room on it. And that's one metal that, in terms of its availability, is only really available in South Africa and Russia on any meaningful scale. You get a bit in Canada, but literally they're rats and mice of the remaining 10%. So scarcity is clearly a point of value, and uniqueness of property, you know, so they do have unique properties as well. So our overall take on that is that the Japanese are sustaining a Ponzi scheme. Now, what is the release valve if you keep insisting that your debt is worth something it absolutely isn't? Well, people don't want to buy it. That means you end up buying it. So what ends up happening is you're maintaining your own lie because everyone else is calling you on it. A bit like when the French sent their military ship into the New York harbor to fetch their gold. They're saying, look, we just don't believe you. We want to hold it ourselves. And what's actually happening with that is that the yen then devalues because they have to keep printing yen to hold up this artificially high market. So the minute you introduce perversions into a system, there's knock-on effects. There's nothing you do you know, water always finds the level. I can't hold some water in my glass at that elevation. I can put a divisor in my glass, but if I keep pouring in the one half, it will overflow into the other half, and eventually, so the pressure will build. All of these things happen. Nature takes its course. Perversions create similar, symmetric, asymmetric, symmetric shocks in another way. So the currency is the release valve. So if you're going to insist your debt is worth so much, and you're going to proliferate your currency to prove that and sustain it and gobble up all this debt you're creating yourself and say, no, it's still worth that, it's still worth that, then you're going to kill your currency, because people are saying, well, they're clearly proliferating their currency as well. And that is floating. So we'll crush that because the asset is Japanese debt. If they're not letting the debt go down, I'll kill what it's measured in then. One way or another, I won't get away to sell you this empty plastic bottle at $1 million. And you say, no, I'm not sure I'm going to have that, Francis. I'm not sending you my million. You say, well, watch me buy it for $1 million. You say, go ahead, Francis, and I'll pay $1 million for it. And then I'll put another one in front of you and you'll say no again. And I'm going to have to purchase another one for $1 million. And then eventually you're going to say, well, Francis's dollars are probably fake dollars because he's doing a rubbish, the Francis dollar is not worth what it is. So you're short the dollar if I won't let the price of empty water bottles go down. And in essence, that's the obvious trade right now. There's a corollary to that, because many people don't feel comfortable with shorting. We put out on our YouTube that you have high quality brands, great manufacturers that are largely exporters. Toyota is an example. Reliability, top of the Juniper American, surveys. Lexus, a Toyota, people most happy. It always starts, rarely breaks down. Great service. And they sell most of their product to Europeans and Americans, and maybe some Chinese as well, and a bit of South Africans and Australians. So they actually will get a currency that is continuing to appreciate, yet their executives' yen salaries are being deflated. So they start to get a hedge, an international hedge against their currency. Now you can actually buy on the American market, Toyota and Honda, in dollars, and the share is growing in market share. So automotively, I don't think it's the most interesting sector, by the way, but automotively, I would expect Japanese automotive companies to be stealing immense amount of share from the other global makers. And that's bad news for American cars again, especially as I expect the dollar to be initially strong and to react aggressively to the BRICS threat. And that's why the Fed is going to continue to be at the forefront of hawkishness and maintaining rates in the name of fighting inflation, but also in the name of continuing to defend the dollar and keeping it at the front of the pack. Because if you notice what happened when Britain in the pension crisis did, they hadn't done the same degree of rate hike as the US. And as a result, people that held British debt said, sod it, if you're not going to up rates at the rate of America, I'm dumping the British debt and I'll buy the American. I'm going to get a higher yield, and I'm going to be in a currency that's appreciating quicker. So there started to be a run. And then the pensioners weren't getting the yield they needed to pay. The pension companies weren't getting sufficient yield to pay their pensioners. So they then had to sell some of their bonds off. And then there was no bid. So their yield was too low to meet their requirements. And then when they had to sell the actual capital assets that they're there to provide the yield to pay their pensions, there was no bid on it. But they're holding it up at that value. So actually bond markets are fraudulent markets. Truth is, all that debt is not worth anything near what you think it is. And the possibility that it gets left in a legacy reset system behind as this dirty little toxic asset that was milked by these corporate frauds throughout that have benefited by defecating on us, that is the feces literally of our system that they will seek to lock up and leave, and they'll be left behind, and they'll get their clean sheet new start and jubilee. And that the short of debt is the trade, without doubt. And you can certainly in time short Japanese debt because they're still holding it at 0.5. That's got a longer way to go, but I'm quite happy being short TLT. It's done very, very well for me. So yeah, I don't know if I answered your question. It's quite long form answer, but I hope that gives some color.
Yeah, I think I can repeat that back real quick. So there's a firing order. The pressure is building in the debt markets. The relief valve is the currencies when they try to save the debt markets. So the currencies are just going to drop. And, you know, as an individual, we're looking at, one could follow this by looking at other currencies, watching their bond markets, watching the currencies suffer there. Maybe we price it in terms of gold or something like that. How does one protect oneself in this type of environment of hyperstagflation and the debt that's been piling up, the bad debt, and the mispricing of the debt because they've basically priced it through QE and all this other stuff? How does one protect themselves in this?
It's one of the biggest challenges everybody faces, which is why the traditional financial advisory services that are available are completely under-equipped and will not be giving you the kind of guidance that I allege to give, because they are not prepared for what's coming. They traditionally set up over the course of the history of it's almost like recency bias, where the recency is the last 40 years of financial systems, where a 60-40 bond portfolio is, you know, was great. And we many times said, the death of the bond market, it's going to kill the 60-40 bond portfolio. You're heading for another negative year on bonds, where the inflation rate is quite a bit higher than what is declared by the Bureau of Labor Stats. Go check out your own American friend, John Williams of Shadow Stats, for the fullness on that. He continues to measure inflation according to the Ronald Reagan era 80s inflation rate. So you are in, and they are deflating debt. They're doing it in two ways. You're declaring a much lower inflation than exists, so your true inflation rate is a lot higher. You still probably not got a positive turn on interest rates and the actual inflation rate. You're still in a stimulative environment, believe it or not. You aren't feeling that stimulated because the liquidity is being reduced as well. They were pumping huge amounts of liquidity, and now they've withdrawn that. So what you got is a much more scarcity. By the way, that leans into a dollar strength spike, not away from, because globally, the offshore dollars are being denied. And they needed to serve debt on people that were stupid enough to get indebted in a currency they didn't control. That the keys for that control lies with the Federal Reserve, who's currently turning the screws and making their eyes water. So the safety mechanisms is physical things, unleveraged, self-reliance, community, local connectivity for food supply, keeping government as much out of your life as possible, not suffering the delusion that you're going to vote yourself some freedom in any of this. You won't. This has to play out. It's almost, it's a bit like the Inception movie. People say I'm nihilistic because it's too negative. Nihilism is actually, if you look at the definition, it's refusing, one of the aspects of the definition is refusing to accept an absolute truism, and the other part is it's no use, just destroy everything. But the actual refusing to see an absolute truism is in the Inception movie. You'll remember they dropped time zones, and there was a car that was smashed over a bridge, and they were all falling. I don't know if you remember this as a metaphor, but then they dropped time zones where years at the much lower time frames were only fractions of a second on the higher time zone. And we're actually already crashed the car off the bridge. We're in the Inception movie, but we've dropped 4 levels into, we're living a full life where you still can do things at these much lower super time frames, and you're only getting a small tick, tick, tick of the car going down, heading towards the water. But there is no, for the current system, there is no, and I'm going to use a word that I think is a very dangerous word, hope. I don't talk about belief or hope. These are very dangerous words. People believe things. Usually those are things that they weren't rationalized into, and you believe it because you can't explain it. So it's something you can't rationalize somebody out of something that they weren't rationalized into. If they're just going to be hard-coded, you know, it's like a CD-ROM where it has certain code just embedded on it. I believe in the tooth fairy. You can't change that. That's the chip. It's just how it comes. So in the same way, belief is a dangerous word, and hope. Hope means when all rational logic points to this being an irredeemable situation, you go, well, there's always hope. You know, a chariot will come out of the sky with a winged warrior and you'll slay all the bad guys. Hope is when you are deep down, your rational mind has recognized that this is a desperate situation, and your mind can't cope with it. So it creates a fairy tale for you to cling on to. So this system is destroyed. It is super hyper leveraged. You don't know the extent of the fraud. A lot of it will come out later in the fullness of it. That which you do know is a tip of the iceberg. We need a new system, but we don't want the original fraudsters that created this malfeasance system that they committed fraud on to be the orchestrators of the new system, because they're just going to use it to seize more control, more power, and be over totalitarian and reduce you even further, while getting a clean sheet again for all the garbage they created that they're not carrying into the new system. So essentially, because of that, it's quite a hardcore situation. You really need to create your localized world, because you can only control that which is in your circle of influence. So your friend, your farmer, your local policeman, making sure that he doesn't lose his head and forget who he works for when he gets draconian rules. We saw quite a depressing degree of compliance out of military and police during the March 2020 events. You need to win them around. You need to be close, and you need to get your local suppliers, your local things. So that's quite a reset-y prepper vibe. And I'm afraid the people that are prepping are the smart people. They are the ones that are brave enough to see the fullness of the danger of the situation. And they aren't being, they don't care about who calls them a nihilist for saying, the Vikings are coming, rather, and they're not getting on their knees and praying. They're actually preparing. They're building fortitude. God helps those who help themselves. And we need a lot more people that are actually actively taking. And you start at the local level, and that's how you win out on the top level. Because when they come with their middle management of their control triangle down to the local level, they must run into resistance. And the people can just say, no, we're not having that. No, we're not having that. I mean, in South Africa, I'll give you a silly example. Particularly our Black people of color, African indigenous population that were under the apartheid system, they developed a culture of resistance. So now that it's not the apartheid system, but now it's essentially a ANC Black African government, they put up all these highway toll gates and claim to want to charge everyone, and everybody just refuses to pay. Everyone just refuses. And because everybody refuses, enforcement's impossible. Everyone refuses. So that was one example where actually non-compliance on grand scale has just flummoxed them. And they've gone and shoehorned a couple of big corporates that work here, like Microsoft and all of them, and they can't be seen not to pay. So you actually have a handful of corporates that have to hold a line that they're compliant to law that are paying, and the rest of the population are all turning down. And I mean, that's white, black, brown, they're refusing to pay. And they've installed all these things and they don't pay. Now, it's hard to get that level of community. You have to start local, and what you need is lots of other people starting local, and then you have localized managers that get in touch with other localized managers, and you grass up, because all this totalitarianism is coming top down, and the way you've got to fight it is localized grass up against totalitarianism down. And that's the fullness of the war that you're facing, and you need more people to recognize that, and not to say, oh, you're dashing our hopes, this president's going to save us, RFK will save us, Trump too will save us, all of these voting, you don't vote yourself for freedom, unfortunately, especially, when you're in such a spiral of escalating desperation in terms of the end game of the financialization. They're all more and more fearful of what the social backlash will be. They have to seize more control and dominance to ensure their own safety. So it's just a vicious fight. Me and you started play wrestling, and then you hit me below the belt, and I got really angry, and I swung for your eye, and now we're just out and out brawling. And you have to recognize you are in a fight to the death against your own dark state and government. That's your war, and you're being distracted by nationalization. This is a global disease that is a network that is global. And by keeping you in a national box where you should be Ukraine versus Russia and everything else, you're forgetting that it's statism against freedom, citizen freedom. That is your big battle right now. And you've got to focus on wealth, you've got to focus on security, protection, and it all. And we follow the money, and we have the hunt volatility funnel method that has put us in how we called that short on oil, and we were similarly long gold. Many people don't realize that the lead up into the March 2020 events was very strong for gold, and it had a small dip down in events, came quite back up, and then continued to run to 2000. So that was a delta neutral trade. What that means, it was commodity neutral. We were measuring through 360-degree analysis that one commodity was chronically going to outperform one that was hopelessly going to underperform. That was a very powerful trade because you made money on both legs. And this is the key thing people can understand. They can't crash this thing without certain markets moving. And there's certain things that are obvious that they have to move. Debt has to devalue, and they are devaluing it. That's why their rates are going up. And that's why people say, but we can't afford for rates to go up anymore. It's not about what you can afford. It's about the fact that they have to smash debt to virtually zero. It may not be zero when they call quits. They'll say, oh, it's effectively bankrupt, let's call it quits. It might not be at zero at that moment, but essentially it's got to go down. And these interest rates are actually not as positive as you think. They're still negative to your true inflation rate in terms of how they proliferate. So you're in a hyper stagflationary event where you've got to see an entire asset class devalue away to virtually zero, or to the point where they call it over. It's like our brawl is going on and I've literally got you in a double Nelson and you're choking, and someone taps and says, okay, you won, don't kill him. So it doesn't have to be death, but it has to be complete submission, where they then throw in the towel. And that is essentially where we are. And that means certain things are going to collapse completely, and other things that are physical that you hold. And I'm afraid to say there's been a lot of tampering at the legal level as well. So possession is 9/10 of the law, and keeping it stum is very important. If you think I've got a bunch of gold, but I've got it at JP Morgan, vaulting services in New York, good luck. Good luck when everyone else is queuing outside and the hypothecation and all the frauds are suddenly coming out and you're asking for your gold. So I would also say you need to learn to keep quiet. And I do actually think at some point they're going to want to have clipboards on all assets, particularly valuable assets like the PMs, and you'll be encouraged to own up in the first thing and say, no, this is just tokenization. It can be easier for you to sell later. You won't have to deliver it. We can put it somewhere safe for you. Lots of con artistry and chicanery. And first they'll gather the information. There'll be pressure put in your banks. There'll be pressure on other people. You'll be sent letters saying, we understood that you made the following purchases with this, a recognized bullion dealer. Where is it located? Please confirm. This is for your safety and your security, yada, yada, fish base. Ignore. Black gold will exist and it'll have a lower price because people say, well, it's there's a crime holding it. The criminals are your extractors in chief, your statist extractors. This is us against them. It is a damn war. You need to understand it. And their goal is to leave you absolutely poverty-stricken and totally reliant on them, so that whatever welfare they give you, you will sign and do and comply whatever is necessary. Otherwise, down on the social score, can't buy that steak today, no more travel, etc., etc. This is totalitarianism. CBDCs are poison, insist on cash, boycott companies and places that insist you use cards. It's time to fight back. It's time to use payment principles. It's time to get physical as they are getting hyper digital. Remember, the truth is always the complete inverse of what they do. If Tony Blair says something, I invert it and I know exactly what to do. It's simple as that. It truly is where we are. These are the inversion, perversion times. It's a core phrase that I use. You're getting inversion, you're getting perversion, you're getting the whole bang shoot. It's a cultural war. It's so many fronts to keep you spinning. To manage your wealth, you've got to keep an eye on the ball, and you've got to protect it. And many of you are men here. You've got to protect your family. For the ladies, ask your husbands and your relatives, what are they doing, and get involved, because there's going to be a real force set out to impoverish you, because that's how they'll totally control you.
So looking at precious metals, I mean, anything that you can buy physically would be a pretty good bet. Platinum, palladium, silver, gold, anything that you can hold and touch, or are there specific monetary metals like gold and silver that are more preferable in this type of environment?
So I'll give you, to respect your question, I'll first give you a specific answer on that. There are relative valuations and value represented by certain precious metals, and we actually chart gold versus palladium, gold versus platinum, platinum versus silver. I look at all of them to try to determine relative strengths inside the category. However, I do want to stress the macro, I think, is good for precious metals. However, if we are to get some form of demand destroying events, technically, right now on silver, we're in a tightening of range, and there is a likely breakout coming. And actually, we've got a bit of a warning, I think, maybe on copper. I don't know, couple of things showing some stress. And unfortunately, when people are in deep stress and it's a choice of making a mortgage payment or a rent payment, they sell that which always gets a bid. So, you know, my beloved mum passed away, I don't know how many decades ago it was. Her rings, her diamond rings, despite her always securing good stones, they were worth nothing. No one wanted to pay anything for them. The Krugerrands, everybody was within a few percent of spot. So a highly liquid, everybody wants it, market in gold, that's what people sell under distress. So it was just an interesting exercise. Diamonds aren't money at all. Buy your fiance, you know, a big ass gold ring, but don't waste money on stones. And as a result, unfortunately, when people are under stress, what you'll actually get is they chase the liquidity. So that's people are quick, sell their Bitcoin and gold, etc. I'm not equating them, but those things are easily sold. You don't easily sell your house, for example. It's not quite as liquid, and usually you need it. So what tends to happen in the early stages of a demand destroying event, which I think is potentially possible, and they are bringing on us ever tightening harder for longer. And this is probably going to be true. And they're going to say, well, we did tell you so. Afterwards, it's going to be much higher for much longer, because they're actually watching the debt situation, not your pain. They don't care for your pain. They're watching the debt and the sustain and the threat to the dollar. So that's why they've got to stay out in front. The dollar needs to be the front runner. If you think of the Tour de France, it has to be in the first peloton in the front, making the pace. Because the minute it doesn't, and it slows its rates of increase, and some other nation increases it, it suddenly will tumble down very, very abruptly. So the Fed is going to be the king cheerleader. And people who were treating this as a game as when the pivot. They're all talking like pivot 1 year. And, you know, 2 years ago, everyone was saying buy bonds, wear diamonds. And I was saying you couldn't be more wrong. You shouldn't be buying diamonds. You would do better buying coal. And bonds are the worst asset class. You've just finished a 40-year bull. And in every instance, both those things are tremendously down, both diamonds and bonds. And coal is immensely up. So where coal didn't sound cool, but it was. And this is just the beginning. And you don't have 40 years to unwind what took you 40 years to put on. So you know, traditional markets are escalator to the upside, elevator, and I'd say snapped cord elevator to the downside. This is going to be a plummet. You're going to do in 40 years, you'll probably do in 4.5 years what took you 40 years on the upside, on the escalator. Markets do not come down like they go up. And the sad fact is, shorting is amazing. And I only when I devised HVF method and I had a stop, an entry, and a real target, could I short. I was always a long only guy, and I battled and I couldn't hold it. And actually the markets can swing quite wildly on shorts, but when you have a method, you know where you'll stop and you're interested and you leave it in. You make the most profits in the shortest time. It truly is how it is. And let me tell you, there's plenty of good quality shorts out there, and most of them in the financial realm. I mean, we've even shorted Pfizer, which is not a very popular company right now on a macro head and shoulders. That continues to go down. From way up mid-40s, it's trading low 30s now. It's 32 last time I saw. Puts on that can be done. So you can also use options as well. But there are longs, as I told you. Toyota, Honda in the automotive industry, and other high-quality global manufacturers in there. And you can even buy them on the American market in dollars so that you don't get the yen reducing. There's other things we're in, the precious metals, oil, and uranium. I mean, uranium, we had a HVF set up on uranium. It's absolute ripper. It's a beauty. And I think you were involved, and you have some of your community involved in that. And it's turned out phenomenal. The whole hoax of wind as energy replacement and the inconsistency and all of that is unraveling. The whole ESG thing that BlackRock has been undermining. And now you have the issue. So here's why it's interesting. I mean, we interviewed Chris McIntosh, another very interesting guy who's got offshore drilling. Now there's virtually little offshore drilling going on. Now, I think he said the ticker mark for a proper offshore drilling rig is about 5 billion. You can't even get a slot to get one of those things made, and it will take 5 years before it even has a host of a chance of even coming out the factory. Never mind, the steel price will likely go up on you 3 times. You'll get 4 revisions to your price. That's where you are. So the existing drills are worth their weight in gold, and many of them got an absolute baptism of fire, obviously with the event that we predicted, and all their debt got rinsed and phoenixed. All the ones that went bankrupt, and the pieces have been picked up. I mean, how many people can buy offshore drills, and how many people, platforms, how many wanted to buy them when oil was naught at the spot level and minus 40 on the futures level? Nobody. So now those that have those things are sitting on gold mines, because oil's now heading back in the direction of $100, greatly diminished dollars, I will add, in a highly inflationary environment. And it's in everything inflation. So everybody goes, oh, we won the war on inflation. I saw Goldman Sachs, a guy called Brooks, saying, again, inflation is proven to be transitory. And I'm like, man, you're having your first pullback and you're comparing year on year. When you're initially comparing year on year on a much lower level, now you're comparing to a much higher level, and you're saying it's only gone up 4% on a much higher basing point from 1 year ago, and you think that's it. That's a bit like me doing 300 kilometers an hour in my Porsche Turbo and saying, I'm only accelerating at 0.1. You know, we're going to be slowing down to naught soon. It's a second derivative completely. So people don't understand that the energies markets are going to continue to keep inflation up. Oil's in plastics, it's in delivery, it's in travel, it's in everything. Everybody knows that. So that is a major inflationary event. And of course, people have to fill up all the time in devaluing currencies at the same time that 2-income households are living on credit cards. I mean, how does this not lead to eventual devastation? And the central banking cartel are the volatility. Remember, inflation is policy to them. It's how they enrich themselves. Inflation is policy. And one of the best ways to generate inflation is, of course, warfare, especially when you own the military-industrial complex. You can also do pharmaceutical-industrial complex warfare, and you've had your first taste of a grand scale of that as well. So, I mean, we have a very aggressive corporate fraud class that involve politicians, corporate CEOs, right the way through BlackRock, that will lead you all the way back to the City of London and the old families. And I'm afraid America was never born free. It was born in masonry by those same owned people. And I know you love, you know, freedom and all of this, and born free and et cetera, et cetera. You were never born free. You were never born free, and neither was any other country. And it's hard to hear because you're proud of your country, and we all have a bit of nationalism in us, and our symbolism and all of that, and it's emotive. But you weren't born free, and the corporate tick and the fascist malfeasance has now prevailed right through your blood system. And you were born new and fresh, and you were used for 100 years. But the virus that was there right at birth is now run right through all your veins, and every organ is now diseased with it. And in a debt financialization sense, you're a 90-year-old granny who drank too much and smoked too much your whole life, and your liver and hearts are all on you know, their last legs. And I'm afraid to say that, and I'm sure some people will hate me for saying that. As I say, always get on great with Americans as people, but that's what they've done. But the only joy you can have is that you're in good company, because everybody else has also been doing the same thing. The leper colony is no joke. So it's a synchronized global takedown. And unfortunately, national governments are largely just localized puppets nowadays to much greater, more evil transnational forces. So this is why you've got to get local, and you've got to get on it. And you've got to use their tools against them as well, because if they write laws that allow Tony Blair to have a foundation and Clinton to have a foundation, maybe you should have a foundation and some of the protections too. We help our guys get that. So the whole thing is, you know, I didn't design this tent. I can't fix it. I'm just Francis with a YouTube channel and a medium-sized community and some trading calls. Unfortunately, I'm not going to get George Soros's funding for my agenda. I don't think he's going to be writing the checks. But what you can do is affect and influence through your talking to your audience directly, telling some hard-hitting truths, maybe being resented for it. Your comments will tell. But at the same time saying, the way we get through this is grassroots up. You've got to realize everything is contaminated at the top. You know, you don't You don't start putting fresh blood in a body that's still got the virus, or putting HIV blood back into the body. You've got to start afresh. You've got to be clean. And you've got to recognize the great truth that this thing is the Inception truck that's already crashed over the bridge, and you are slow motion watching it hit the water. And so you are on a certain amount of time. And it's only because we 4 layers down that we got the time to have this discussion, to do some planning, move some money, buy some metals, buy small holdings, do some farming, low level, do some barter trade with neighbors, have like-minded, make sure we got some security, because all those that haven't prepared are going to be coming. And, you know, the zombie rules and Amazon, there's already medical possibilities that actually see that these weren't accidental. I mean, that sounds absurd, but that there could be people that will automatically, with various mobile phone, who knows, this might be garbage, it might be a random conspiracy theory story, or it might be real. I can't tell you I know everything. All I know is I follow the money, and the charts are the truth. It's the fingerprint of God. If you want to believe in God, the handwriting on the wall is the truth of the group of the greatest people with money. What are they doing? And I never doubt that, because the one thing they are based on is greed and self-enrichment. And therefore I make sure I'm right on their coattails. And that's probably, you know, all we can do apart from talking, sharing, and getting involved.
So Francis, what is there anything else that you'd like to share, or anything else that you have that you'd like the viewers to hear?
If you're sitting there right now and you're feeling helpless, let me just tell you, you are born into these times because you can cope with them. And, you know, running the harshest obstacle course of many generations, let me tell you, other generations have had unbelievable obstacles. The Bolshevik Revolution, imagine being, you know, a young Russian during that period, an Armenian during the Armenian genocide, and many other periods. So A, we're not the only ones to face hardship. B, we've got to man up and deal with it. C, we've got to get organized with like-minded and not tolerate any voting for freedom fallacies. You've got to get organized at a localized level. Presidents, prime ministers are selected, not elected. And as you've seen with the lot of the doubts that you're having around your own Biden election, they can be bent, broken, and deceived. So deception is the game. So statism is the enemy. Freedom is your friend. Freedom of movement is your friend. Freedom of engagement is your friend. Censorship, surveillance is coming. That's what they want to bring. That's what the CBDCs are all about. I am at one of many, but I run a community of like-minded that intends to build wealth through this and to do the damnedest to secure further freedoms, be organized as a network across the world, sharing true information as reported at an almost citizen journalist level, and to build wealth through these occasions to fight the great impoverishment that they intend to bring on the lower and middle classes, to ensure that they are the owners of all and that you will own nothing and be popped up on their happy pills that they'll be stuffing you with. And I say no to all of that. I want to be freedom. I'm jumping on a motorcycle. I'm going 10 days through the African desert up to Lake Kariba and down to Victoria Falls. I'm living life. I'm enjoying it. I treat every year as a new lease on life. And then I get an extension if I play well. And I'm getting wealthier, smarter, better informed. And I intend to do that for all my community members. And we are trading our way through reset, investing our way through reset. And you've got to understand the playbook, because the game just changed. It's like playing NFL and suddenly it's basketball. The rules just changed. You need a new coach. You need a new set of rules. You need a different kind of guy. You don't need a linebacker. You need a 6'8" guy. And that's literally how it's come. And most people aren't recognizing the pivots, and that's the problem. And if my YouTube channel, if you want to hear more about some of the things we're doing, is the Market Sniper. I also run a crypto one because it is playing a role. I recognize it's part of the matrix. It is going to play a role, but there will be extreme wealth and the insiders will be in it created. Right now, it's not that interesting, but when the money is flowing in different areas, and we're one of the first to spot it in the great macro trends. So join us, trade the macro trends to wealth in reset times. And God bless you all. Thank you for putting up for my slightly black-pilled, ranty, assertive style, but I've been in this space. I've seen this thing coming for about 25 years. So, I'm kind of a bit belligerent, but, take action and you will lose any negative mindset. This is also a psyop on your mindset. I want to give you something for your mental health. Get up and take action. Get batteries, get solar, invest in something that's for you forever, for your system and your family. Avoid conspicuous consumption. You don't need a third car or a fourth car or to upgrade it right now. What you need is pure reset structures and things. And the more action you take and the more you're getting ahead on that front, the better you feel and the more you are leading by example. It's not just what you say, it's what you actively do. And if you're ready to do all of those things, you're one of mine. And whether you choose to follow us or join us or not, God bless you. And I want to see you win. Thank you for having me on, Andy.
Thank you for coming, Francis. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Absolute pleasure.